Today we're hosting Professor Miguel Etinger de Araújo, Júnior. Sorry, Prof. I was practicing that pronunciation. I hope I did it justice. Just for some background and on why we are hosting this lecture, Prof. Miguel is from Brazil, but he's not here on holiday though. He came to visit South Africa for 6 months to conduct research on how urban law and environmental law can contribute to cities' responses to climate change. And he intends to publish his research once his trip comes to an end. And we at CLES, and in particular Prof. Oliver Fuo, our chairholder here at CLES, hosted Prof. Miguel for the first 3 months of his visit here in Potchefstroom, and that was from May to July. And then he traveled all the way down to the Western Cape to the University of Stellenbosch for the remainder of his stay. But as part of Prof. Miguel's research process, he also planned to deliver a public lecture, and that is why we are here today. I would also like to add, Prof. Miguel has quite an impressive resume. I will not go over every single detail, but I at least want to mention that he graduated and obtained all his law degrees, including his doctorate degree, at the State University of Rio de Janeiro, and he's currently a professor of environmental, urban, and administrative law at the State University of Londrina, and he has been since 2003. This is in the city of Paraná in Brazil. He teaches at postgraduate level as well, and he is or at least was a member of various associations, such as the Urban Law Special Commission and the Right to the City Commission, both of which exist under the Brazilian Bar Association. And he also has many publications in this field under his belt. Prof. Miguel, welcome. We are honored to host you here today. To everyone else, please just take note of our house rules. We will give Prof. Miguel an opportunity to present his lecture, and once he's done, we will open the floor for questions in case you have any. You're welcome to type your questions in the chat box, or you can post them verbally during the Q&A session. I should point out that there might be a little bit of a language barrier, so we would prefer if you rather type your questions in the chat box. It would just be easier for Prof. Miguel to answer them that way. And then for the rest of the lecture, I also have to ask you to please keep your camera switched off for the sake of bandwidth, and also keep your microphones muted. Okay, then, Prof. Miguel, when you're ready, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lawrence. Thank you for all. Thank you, Professor Oliver. Nice to be here. I'll share some slides. Okay. With this presentation, I will go on. This presentation is divided into 6 brief topics: how the urbanization process took place in Brazil, define some concepts of environmental justice and the right to the city, the adaptation actions that can be implemented, the Brazilian legal system for regulating urban land and what is social function, some urban legal instruments aimed at climate adaptation, is some final consideration. The first topic, there is a Brazilian jurist who is very well known in my country called Miguel Reale, and he works on the idea of the three-dimensionality of law. Law would be fact, value, and norm. The fact, it is what is happening today, and this fact is the object of analysis of law. This fact needs to be contextualized and value assigned to it. What does it mean for today's society? This analysis must consider historical and current factors, and the law must consider what is intended for the future. From there, the law establishes a standard of conduct. And what should be the legal regulation of urban real estate in Brazil today in 2024? First, I need to understand how we got the current situation. So I'm going to go back a little bit, but I'll come back to the present day. The time frame is the year 1500 when the Portuguese arrived in what is now called Brazil. There is not just one history to be told. In the case of the Portuguese who arrived in Brazil, the most common history is that the Portuguese expedition intended to reach India on a route that was already known, to search for goods to be sold in Europe. However, they arrived on the American continent. At that time, there was between 2 and 5 million indigenous people in the territory that is now Brazil. Today, we have 1.7 million indigenous people with approximately 300 different ethnic groups. 36.7% of these current indigenous people live in their original territories. So, since the arrival of the Portuguese in Brazil, there have been several economic cycles up to the present day. First, there was a process of consolidation of land ownership with the extraction of the so-called pau-brasil, a very valuable wood at the time and to this day. Then there was the production of sugar from sugarcane, which led to almost 2 centuries of activity. Later, the main economic activity in Brazil was the extraction of gold and its shipment to the Portuguese crown. It's important to note that these economic cycles aimed to maintain control over the territory. This occurred with the enslavement of indigenous people and Black Africans taken by the Portuguese. It was only in 1757 that the enslavement of indigenous people was officially prohibited. And it was only in 1888 that the enslavement of Black people was officially prohibited in Brazil. Well, understanding how life in Brazil has been during these 300 years is important to understand Brazilian society today. For more than 3 centuries, there was a model of exploitation of natural resources destined for people who did not live in that territory. At the beginning of the 19th century, the Portuguese royal family arrived in Brazil fleeing Napoleon's troops in Europe. Several people from that continent also come with the royal family. At this time, there was a strong process of investment in urban infrastructure to meet the needs of these people who arrived in Brazil. In 1824, Brazil declared its independence, becoming a monarchical regime independent of Portugal. This monarchy lasted until 1889. Before that, however, in 1888, slavery was abolished. This fact is also important for understanding the urbanization process in Brazil, since a large mass of people without specialized labor was available to society without any process of qualifying these people. After the proclamation of the Republic and with the need for workers for agriculture, there was an incentive for immigration of people from Europe. Thus, several people from Portugal and Italy went to Brazil, and also people from Spain and Germany. These immigrants worked mainly on coffee farms. This immigration Europeans is also important for understanding the urbanization process in Brazil, since in the middle of the 20th century, there was a large internal migration of people from the countryside to the cities. Brazil began the 20th century with agriculture and mineral extraction as its main economic activities. After the 1930s, an industrialization process began in Brazil. At this time, the population also began to migrate from the countryside to the cities. However, it was in the 1970s that there was a shift from the rural population to the urban population. This was largely due to the so-called Green Revolution, which was a worldwide movement in industrialized countries encouraging the use of land for products to be sold in the global north. As a result, there is an investment in machinery and chemical products on plantation. This was a relevant factor in the major change from the rural population to the urban population in Brazil. From the 1980s onwards, there was a strong process of unplanned urbanization. This situation led to great socio-economic inequalities, including in the process of urban land occupation. There was also a strong concentration of wealth, a situation that continues to this day. Unplanned urbanization leads to social spatial segregation, as you can see in the example in the photo below in the city of São Paulo, Brazil. Currently, we have the following situation. More than 80% of the Brazilian population lives in urban areas. And the main economic activities in Brazil are the provision of services with approximately 80%, followed by industrial and agricultural activities. Here, a fundamental book for understanding the formation of the political system in Brazil from the 19th century to present day is the book Coronelismo, the Municipality and Representative Government in Brazil. That's a good book to read to understand how Brazil is now. Well, the second topic, let's move on to the second topic, which is the concepts of environmental justice and the right to the city. In relation to the high concentration of people in urban areas in Brazil, we face some challenges. Among them, achieving environmental justice and the right to the city. The concept of environmental justice is related to the idea of environmental racism, linking such discrimination to true racial segregation. In other words, Black people were demonstrably occupying territories with worse environmental quality. This type of racism has been observed in several countries around the world, especially against traditional and indigenous people, and is often related to economic development, agribusiness, and forms of energy, which in turn promotes environmental, cultural, and social degradation, especially against the communities most vulnerable to this process. This racism and environmental injustice also spreads through urban spaces, with emphasis on issues related to housing, appropriation of resources arising from relationships with the environment, access to quality infrastructure, and application of the concepts of the social function of property. In this sense, those areas that were more organized, as well as better located in relation to the city center, ended up being reserved by speculative capital for the wealthiest layers of society. This is a self-ordering of the market that without effective action by the state in the urban land markets, allowed properties and the rights arising from them to not fulfill their social function, but rather to only privilege economic issues arising from the interests of their holders. Despite the recognition of social function of property and its subordination to the collective interest, market freedom prevails to the detriment of state control. Therefore, the best areas do not perform any social function, but an economic function for the benefit only of their holders. At the international level, intensifying the issue of environmental injustice, the creation of the aggressive not in my backyard policy stands out, which occurred due to the political perspective of capital in the second half of the last century, which began to allocate waste and environmental damage to countries other than the major roads of wealth arising from production process, generally those that were not at the center of contemporary capitalism. Thus, the profits and benefits arising from environmental exploitation in turn are displaced to the major polluters. Environmental justice is understood as a set of principles that ensure that no person, whether due to ethnicity, race, or class, bears a disproportionate share of the environmental consequence resulting from negative processes arising from movements related to economy, public policies and programs, as well as due to the state's lack of action in these areas. It can be said that environmental justice is part of the environmental movement, which today works to defend various elements of nature and their relationship with human life, but not only human life. It is in its genesis a worldwide movement that challenges the way in which natural resources are used by men. Several activities related to the environment can cause environmental and social damage. For information and reflection, we have this movement that is publicized at an international level, Environment Justice Atlas. According to its organizers, situations of environmental injustice are highlighted due to several activities related to the environment. Brazil has many more situations than South Africa, which, however, is also considered a country where there is an environmental injustice. And what is the relationship between environmental justice and the social function of real estate property? Let's continue. Now, rights to the city. In addition to the concept of environmental justice, it's important to understand what the expression rights to the city means. Both are theoretical and concrete assumptions for a real understanding of the social function of urban real estate. Sorry. And which city are we talking about? Today, cities are the process of transformation of territorial space over time, from the first urban settlements with food production and animal husbandry to space that were trade routes. And these trade routes needed warehouse when the process of formation of medium and large cities in the world began. Then reality show us that there is a large concentration of people in urban areas and that there is a need to meet the multiple demands of the people who live, work, or circulate there. These city models that emerged from the middle of the last century are a reflection of the political and economic situation on the time. The Marxist philosopher Henri Lefebvre contextualized the quality of life in cities in the 1960s. He stated the need to transform Paris at that time, a city with strong industrialization and pollution. It served economic interests that were distinct from the interests of the local population. This thinking is gaining other dimensions based on this ideological platform with the growth of new demands due to the great diversity of people who start to live in urban environments. We are talking about demands of local population, and there is a need to meet these demands. Here, the law presents itself a possible instrument to meet these demands. Obviously, the law itself has several facets. It can be both an instrument of individual and collective liberation, as well as an instrument of oppression and maintenance of inequalities. Current large urban centers around the world have multiple interests that lead to disputes and the need to consensus. After all, how should the process of occupying urban land take place? There are demands for housing, circulation, environmental quality, among others. There is therefore an international recognition of the need to think about the best ways to occupy this urban land. Here are some definitions that may help you understand the full scope of the term rights to the city. From David Harvard, the British geographer, rights to the city is very far from individual freedom of access to urban resources. It is the right to change ourselves by changing the city. Tiago Aparecido Trindade, a social scientist from Brazil, and Edésio Fernandes, a Brazilian jurist and urban planner. Edésio says, it's imperative that jurists establish the much needed bridges between the legal studies and urban and environment studies as only an interdisciplinary view of the phenomenon of intensive urbanization would account for the complexity of the legal issues and problems of cities. Well, within the scope of international and national legal standards, we have a document prepared by the United Nations during Habitat 3, which expressly mentions the rights to the city, the new urban agenda. This concept had already been under construction for some time, with the Global Charter for the Right to the City, finalized in Brazil, being worthy of note. The right to the city is expressly provided for in Brazilian legislation, especially in the city statute, which established as one of the guidelines of urban policy, the right to urban land, housing, a healthy environment, urban infrastructure, transport, public services, the right to work and leisure for the present and future generation. So the third topic is the climate change and adaptation. The implementation of environmental justice and the rights to the city depends on several factors. One of them is the climate issue, which has been the subject of greater attention in recent years. Are we in a climate emergency? Here I bring a series of extreme weather events that have been occurring of the years. So since Hurricane Katrina in 2005, several events have been occurring around the world, droughts, frosts and intense cold, tornadoes, droughts and floods. Here, the Cantareira system in São Paulo, Brazil, It's the largest water reservoir that supplies the largest city in South America. Flooding in a city in the Amazon region of Brazil, increasingly strong tornadoes, the melting of polar ice sheets due to global warming. Another example is a cyclone that occurred in 2022 in Madagascar, Durban, rain bomb. And here is the biggest flood we have had in Brazil in recent decades in the south of the country, which was at the beginning of this year, with several consequences that are felt to this day, including the closure of the international airport in the city of Porto Alegre, the capital of the state, the province. 3 months later, nowadays, Brazil is experiencing its worst drought in the story, with thousands of fires. One observation, in addition to the severe droughts, some fires were intentionally started by some people. Well, all those events have indeed occurred. That's a fact. But are we in a climate emergency? What I want to demonstrate is that several studies indicate an increase in the Earth's global temperature with several consequences. In July of this year, we reached the highest average global temperature in history for July. Well, the main document to be analyzed is the 6th IPCC report, which contains a series of studies pointing to climate change and the effects of this change on various sectors of the world. The IPCC studies indicate that we are indeed experiencing a climate emergency with the need to adopt various measures. Another group of people understand that no, we are not in a climate emergency. And anyone interested can access this website, clintel.org. So, well, in relation to climate change, there are two actions to be taken, mitigation and adaptation. The aim of this research is to study adaptation measures and how the social function of urban real estate, a legal instrument, can contribute. Mitigation measures can be used in synergy with adaptation, as demonstrated by the reports presented by Working Group 2, which is more focused on adaptation, and by Working Group 3, which is more focused on mitigation. Sorry. The Brazilian legal system for regulating urban land and the social function. Before laws, acts, articles, paragraphs, two important points for an effective legal system that meets the real demands of society. One, understand the reasons why some laws don't work. Two, decolonizing the legal system. The implementation of the concept social function of property will not be effective if these premises are not considered. They will only be letters of intent in the legislation. Okay. One of the reasons I came to study here in South Africa was the socio-economic similarity with Brazil. After living here for 4 months, this hypothesis seems to be confirmed. Sorry. In Brazil, we have several laws on various subjects. However, not all of them are enforced. We often say that the law didn't catch on. Regarding these aspects, I am not yet able to say how it works in South Africa. So the fact that some laws are not applied in Brazil can be explained by our history of legislation and constitutions. Since Brazil's independence from Portugal in 1824, Brazil has had 7 constitutions. The first, during the imperial period, was strongly centralizing. It was drafted and granted by the emperor of the time, Dom Pedro I. This excessive centralization led to discontent among sectors of Brazilian society, which led to the proclamation of the Republic in 1889 and the promulgation of the Republican Constitution of 1891. This constitution provided for the separation of the state from the Catholic Church, which at the time was the one providing social assistance to the population. Without the church providing this assistance and without the state foreseeing how to replace the church, the poorest population was left without the possibility of exercising their fundamental rights. In 1934, a new constitution was enacted with social advances, including the expropriation of real estate for social purposes. A characteristic of this constitution was a paradox between a liberal state and an interventionist state. A few years later, the then president of the Republic, Getúlio Vargas, carried out a self-coup d'etat, inaugurating a new phase of the Republic. After the self-coup, we had a new constitution in 1937 of a highly authoritarian nature, concentrating powers in the executive and which had no popular participation. In 1946, in the post-World War II period, a new constitution with liberal characteristics was approved. Unlike the social welfare constitutions that were being passed in Europe and other parts of the world, there was no progress in the social issue due to the liberal and patrimonialist ideals that existed in Brazil from the end of the previous century until the beginning of the 20th century. After a few years of some institutional normality, and due to external influence combined with internal interests, a civil and military coup d'etat took place in 1964. There was a democratic rupture in the country, which led to a period of extreme official violence with attacks on individual and collective rights, torture, and murder of ideological opponents of the state. In 1967, a new constitution was formally enacted to legitimize the military dictatorship of the time. There was a provision for state intervention in private real estate for urban reform purposes. And here it's worth mentioning an aspect of the Brazilian constitutions over the years. Several provisions for social rights, despite being formally provided for in the constitutions, were never implemented, as is the case with this provision for agrarian reform. During the military dictatorship, several institutional acts were issued, the so-called AI. The AI of the Brazilian military dictatorship of that time should not be confused with AI of artificial intelligence. Finally, in 1988, after the end of the military dictatorship, the current federal constitution was enacted, which had intense popular participation with several progressive provisions in the social sphere and in individual collective rights. This constitution also expressly provides for the idea of the social function of urban and rural real estate property. The second point to be analyzed before we enter into the study of the Brazilian legal system for regulating urban land and its social function is the analysis of how the legal system was constructed in Brazil. The current Brazilian legal system was built on the idea of the modern state. This modern state, a reflection of the society of the time, was based on two concepts. The first, private property, and the second, contractual freedom. These were the main guidelines of legal fraud formulated in modernity. The idea of individualism, universality of rights, and subjective rights. In this sense, the consequence in relation to nature would be to classify it as a negotiable asset, something to be appropriated and transformed into some kind of advantage for the individual. Land, both urban and rural, are part of this concept of nature. Therefore, land would only be something to be appropriated, generating wealth for its owner, regardless of whether it brings any harm to the community or the environment itself. Understanding and consequently overcoming these constraints can lead to the formulation of a law that addresses neglected demands with effective application of what's provided for in the legal system. Perhaps we can call this movement decolonization of the legal system. Okay, now yes, from this perspective, we propose to analyze the Brazilian legal system in relation to the regulation of urban land and its social function. Brazil is a federation, it's a federative republic. This means that we have three spheres of power in the country, which are the union, the states, and the municipalities, all of which have the power to legislate and take concrete actions. Here we have a brief summary of how the Brazilian Constitution distributed powers between the union, states, and municipalities. Note that the union has generic powers, and depending on the specificity of the matter, the states or municipalities may legislate and act. We also have the Federal Constitution in its Article 182, which establishes urban policy and determines that there should be a general law of guidelines on urban policy. This general law is the so-called Statute of the City or City Statute, the most important national legislation on the subject. Another important law is the Statute of the Metropolis, which aims to regulate how the entities of the federalism should work together when public policies are related to functions of common interest. Here we have three maps: the metropolitan regions of São Paulo, Johannesburg, and Cape Town, each with their own demands. It's a challenge for public policies to work when states and municipalities have to work in harmony, at least in Brazil. Another important law is the current Forest Code, which, among other things, establishes the need to preserve certain areas in both rural and urban areas. For this study, the regulation of river banks in urban areas is important. How does this preservation relate to the social function? How does this preservation relate to the social function? Example, during heavy rainy seasons, we can have greater permeability and water flow. During these seasons, other rivers can supply the demand for water. For this, it's important that the water is of good quality in order to reduce the costs of its collection and provision. And if the plantation does not go all the way to the riverbank, there is less pesticides to treat, which means less economic cost for the consumer. After all, the treatment costs cannot compromise the financial health of companies or of the state itself. This forest code underwent a change in 2021 that deserves attention. After all, can the environmental preservation zone be reduced when rivers pass through urban areas? Another question, are Brazilian municipalities prepared to carry out a technical analysis with effective public participation and then decide what the best option is? These are some questions. Moving on to the municipal level, we have master plans, which are the most important local laws on urban land regulation. This law will determine what can and cannot be done in relation to urban real estate property rights. In addition to the legislation, there is a need to practical measures, and here are some legal and urban planning instruments that can be implemented to combat climate change. There are a number of instruments that can be used individually or in conjunction with other instruments. Here are some of them presented with the scope of Brazilian legislation. Okay, here we have the SpongeBob. So here is a hypothetical example. If a municipality wish to make an area permeable to rainwater, it's important to highlight that real estate property is considered a fundamental right in Brazil. So this property has an economic content that cannot be taken away with fair compensation. So two urban planning legal instruments can be used together. The onerous granting of the right to build, or simply OODC in Portuguese, or the transfer of the right to build. Urban real estate property rights define its content, that is, what you can build and do on your property. If you want to build beyond the original content of your property rights, and if this is possible where the property is located, the government can charge the owner a fee to cover the need to increase the infrastructure required in the region. This is called the onerous granting of the right to building. Another instrument is the transfer of the right to build. As the name suggests, if the owner has the right to build in a certain location, and for some need of the community, it's better not to build anything, it's possible for him to transfer this building potential to another location provided for in the legislation. By combining the two instruments, it's possible that the right to build is converted into the onerous considerations that should be paid for construction above the basic coefficient. Thus, the location where studies indicate that there should be no construction will be preserved without the owner losing the economic content of the property, since the respective value of the property can be applied elsewhere. If they are well worked together, they can allow the government to take action to make an area permeable to rainwater without removing the economic contents of the property and without the need to spend a lot of money which municipalities normally do not have. Now, some adaptation measures. Some concrete examples of the social function of urban real estate. One in Brazil, another one in Argentina, and the third in Colombia. Cabrinha system in Brazil. This is an example of a small intervention in the municipality of Londrina, where I live. This is the Cabrinha system stream, a small stream with a spring that was in a precarious situation, working with the idea of nature-based solutions. There was this intervention in the location that allowed improvements to the place. Another example is in the Santa Fe region of Argentina. There was a serious problem with constant flooding there due to its geological formation. After an agreement was signed with the German Ministry of the Environment, funding was provided for projects in that region, which established several conditions for construction. For example, rainwater retarders. And it also implemented plans to turn a large part of its territory into permeable areas following the idea of urban sponges. This example is from the city of Medellin in Colombia. Medellin, like other cities around the world, had and continues to have so-called urban heat islands, which are the results of artificial construction that suppress natural vegetation. To improve the situation, one of the measures adopted was the installation of so-called green corridors. Green corridors are an extension of natural areas. They serve to regulate the climate, increase biodiversity, sequester carbon, improve air quality, capture of heavy minerals, reducing the impact of pollution, etc. These urban land regulations aimed at adapting to climate change are part of a set of measures that can be adopted within the concept of smart cities. Smart cities encompass several areas such as governance, economy, mobility, environment, and quality of life. These cities seek to improve the quality of life of their inhabitants, inclusive development, operational efficiency, and economic attractiveness by using information and communication technologies and other innovative solutions. But it's not just about technology, as that would be a limited concept. There must be the joint of human, collective, and artificial intelligence. Smart cities are characterized by a networked infrastructure that promotes political efficiency and cultural and social development. They also value the social inclusion of urban inhabitants and recognize the natural environment as fundamental to the future. There was then in Medellin an incentive to build green roofs and vertical gardens on private and public properties. For public areas, investment was made in green corridors with the planting of vegetation along urban infrastructure. Approximately 30 green corridors were installed, resulting in a decrease in temperatures in these areas of 2 and 3 degrees Celsius. There was also an increase in the diversity of bees and birds, contributing to biodiversity. Moving on to the final considerations. There is not just way to think about law. As previously mentioned, law can be a mechanism for liberation or a mechanism for maintaining inequalities. Therefore, it's important to have a critical mindset about what law is. This presupposes the need for new ways of thinking about this branch of knowledge. Among these new forms, we can mention the recognition of nature as a subject of right, which is not the object of this study, but is part of theories that can contemplate non-hegemonic views, as is the case of the epistemology of the Global South. These ways of thinking about law are based on social and environmental issues without forgetting the economic issue, and also on the consolidation and implementation of the concept of the social function of urban real estate property. The social function indicates that the right to build is conditioned on the promotion of the collective goods, among which is the environmental issue. The contemporary state cannot long simply abstain from private interests, which is the idea of liberal state. This model has already proven to be unsustainable and therefore unfair. An option would be to construct current legislation in the direction of a more interventionist state, including in relation to the state itself. As seen, the mere production of a constitutional or legal text does not guarantee the enforcement of rights. And nowadays, the climate issue has been a fundamental aspect in defining the concept of the social function of real estate. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. Miguel. I have to say, I particularly liked that you framed your discussion from a historical context. It just made it so much easier to absorb all the information. So thank you for that. If you're ready for some questions, I will open the floor for some questions. So I think everyone, if you have a question, please raise your hand, and then we can put it to Prof. Miguel. Anyone? I don't see any hands yet.
There is one question in the chat.
Yes, there's a question.
Let me read.
Okay.
Thank you. Expropriation. About the expropriation. Thank you for the question. Yes, we have the expropriation of the property by social interest or public interest. The government pay an amount of money, and then there is the expropriation. Is a fact, and they can contribute to achieving social change. But union, states, and municipalities can expropriate the land, expropriate the land. Municipalities don't have enough money. States or province, like here in South America, they don't expropriate land. But they have more money than the municipalities. And the union, the national governments, they expropriate some lands principally to do the agrarian reform. Municipalities expropriate by local interest, and the national government to do the agrarian reform. But yes, it's an interesting experience. It's a reality in Brazil. I don't know if I answer.
Prof, perhaps I should add the social debate or legal debate in South Africa on expropriation deals a lot with whether the government should pay compensation or not pay compensation. Have you, in Brazil, has it ever been considered to expropriate land without any form of compensation?
Yeah, as the property of the land is a fundamental right in Brazil, it has its economical relation. So if the government expropriates the land, in as the property is a fundamental right, the government must pay for the expropriation. That is how is in Brazil. In some como é que eu posso falar, in some kinds, some expropriations in Brazil, they don't pay to the owner, but this is rare. It's a criminal thing.
Okay, thanks, Prof. I see there's a second question in the chat box from Kristen. If you would like to read that one for us.
Kristen, hello, Kristen.
Yes.
How do the specific climate change manifest in aliens that change Brazil also influence the application of the social environment? I think in both Brazil and South America, we have a lot of floods and droughts in parts of the country. And Brazil now is starting to do some things with the climate change vulnerabilities and resilience. We don't have so much stretches in Brazil. We have a big flood in this year, this beginning of this year, and all the years we have floods. So the government said, now we will apply some money, now we will do some strategies, but we are not doing what is necessary to principally for adaptation. The social function of urban lands, as the majority of the population is the urban areas, I think it's a good legal instrument to tackling the climate change.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. Kristen. Are you happy? Did that answer your question?
Oliver, the indigenous population is very small. Yes. The Portuguese did almost did a genocide when they were in Brazil. That made us. Yes, we have a tense. Como é que é tenso? I have my translator here. Como eu falo, uma tensão entre indígenas e proprietários. We have a huge tension between indigenous people in Brazil and the land owners with the agricultural. We have strong tension there in Brazil. Indigenous people are not so many person in Brazil, but their territories is large. Okay, it's normal. It's fundamental to the indigenous people to have their large territory to survive, to maintain their culture, their religions, things, and their way of life. Okay, when I say indigenous people in Brazil, who is in the original territories, there are, how can I say, habitus primários, how can I say, they are not in the cities, okay? They are in the forest or another territories with they do their agriculture and create their animals.
It's basically communal land or rural land.
Yes, rural land.
Okay. I have a question. I'll try to explain it, see if we get anywhere. You mentioned that landowners can have a right to build on their land, but sometimes they shouldn't build on their land. Then that right to build can be transferred. Then they go and build somewhere else.
Yeah.
On whose land do they then end up building? Is it state land or someone else's land, or how can they just build on other land?
Traduz aí. Can you repeat the final, Lawrence?
Just on whose land do they go and build, basically? Is it on the state land? So the owner cannot build on his own land. The right to build transferred to different land. On whose land can that owner build?
Whose land?
The state. Who? So state or another owner.
Yes, he can build in his own proper land on in another land of the other person of the state land. They transform the right to build in money. For example, $1,000. Then how is the similarity in another land? $1,000. So you can construct, you can build in another land. If you are if you are not the owner, you can talk about the other land to it's a deal.
Okay, so that would also be expropriation sometimes of the land. Okay.
Yes, you can expropriate.
Okay. I see we have a hand. Brisa raised his hand. Brisa, would you like to answer or pose a question?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Ok. So, pai, se você conseguir desligar abaixar o som aí. I was going to answer Oliver message. He said that the indigenous population in Brazil is very small. That may reduce land tensions, even though they still have. I was going to say that one strategy of colonization in Brazil was to create different racial definitions and names, né, through miscegenation. And then they say that the further you are from the pure indigenous, like you are not indigenous anymore, you are mixed. So you don't have the rights to this land anymore because you don't know the language, you don't know the culture, blah 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 blah. And but today in Brazil, 0.5% of the population is auto-declared as or black or mixed, and we have a increasing number of indigenous people self-recognizing themselves, né? And the official, como que eu traduzo censo? And the official organ in the government to measure, né, how many people are in the country, they historically they stopped using indigenous and created a lot of other names, so it confused people. And yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you, Brisa. Prof. Oliver, would you like to respond to Brisa, or are you satisfied with the answer?
We have another question.
No, I'm satisfied.
Okay, thank you. I would just like to add, I think it becomes interesting when you look at self-recognition of your own identity versus the state or government having to tell you what your identity is or may not be. But perhaps that's a topic for a very different day. Prof. Miguel, I see there's one more question in the chat box by Sizwe.
Okay, Bisway, thank you for your question. We have the terms is defined in law. Okay, what is social or public interest? We have a list of situations that you can put in on what is public or social interest. The main disputes goes to the value of the indemnization. Always the government says your land value 100 and the owner says no, it value 200. So this part go to the justice to a dispute, but the terms are defined in law.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Well, I'll ask one more time. If there's no more questions, then it will be the end of the lecture. So going once, twice, 3 times. Okay, Prof, I see we have no more questions.
Okay.
Thank you very much for the lecture. It was very informative. It was a pleasure to host your lecture here at CLES, and it was also a pleasure to have you join us in Potchefstroom for 3 months. And on behalf of CLES, I want to wish you all the best and good luck with the rest of your research and your stay here in South Africa. I hope we chat again soon. All right. Thank you, Prof.
Okay, thank you, Lawrence, for all. Thank you, Oliver, for the reception, all the other students. It was a pleasure to stay in Poitiers for those 3 months. And we are in Brazil. When you want to go to Brazil, you can send me a message, or if you want to talk about another question of environmental or urban law, just send me an email or a WhatsApp. Thank you.
Will do. Thank you,
It's
Prof.
a pleasure, Miguel. Just to add that we look forward to further collaborating with you. And if you have a conference, an international conference in Brazil, you should let us know. I think we'll be able to, some of us will be able to come present. And we look forward to welcoming you back in CLES again. And I see that for the time you've stayed in South Africa, you are gradually perfecting your English. And it's going to only get better the more you visit. So we look forward to having you again.
Okay, thank you, Oliver.
Yes,
Thank
indeed.
you. Yeah,
Okay.
bye.
Thank you, everyone. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.